The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Commenting on U.S.-Canadian relations, John F. Kennedy once remarked that, quote, geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. Recent U.S. visits by newly elected Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau have placed a spotlight on this important but typically quiet relationship. For many Americans, our common history and culture often obscures the unique role Canada plays on the world stage. To help us explore some critical global issues viewed through a Canadian lens, we're joined today by Ottawa's representative in the American Midwest. Roy Norton serves as Consul General at the Canadian Consulate in Chicago. Prior to assuming this role, he held senior positions in the Canadian Embassy in Washington, in Canada's Parliament, and as Senior Policy Advisor to the Canadian Foreign Minister. Consul General Norton, welcome to International Focus.
Mr. Savage, thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
Well, I thought we'd just jump into some of these issues. First being trade, and particularly something that's gotten a lot of play in the American campaign we're in the midst of, TPP, the
Right.
Trans-Pacific Partnership. So Canada signed, as did many nations, in February. Where does it stand now?
Well, the Canadian government, which is not the government that negotiated TPP on behalf of my country, there was an election last fall and the government changed, is engaged in consultations with Canadians to arrive at a position. I think it's safe to say everybody's watching to see what happens here. The United States was unquestionably the leader in driving TPP, and if it looks as if your country is not going to ratify it, then you may wait a little while for Canadians to ratify it. The Prime Minister just last week in Washington at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce spoke in positive terms about trade and the importance that Canada attaches to trade liberalization. So there's a disposition, I think, to see more trade liberalization. They're consulting on the specifics, and they'll arrive at a conclusion sometime probably this year, I would think.
Yeah, I saw an Angus Reid Institute poll recently that said currently looks like 32% of respondents were for, 20 against, but 49 don't know. I think that's fairly common. The Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade, David Lametti, said we're definitely not taking a position yet. So what is that process like? I mean, how do we get the 49% who don't know to come to an opinion?
Well, the whole point of a high-profile consultative process is to try to increase awareness on the part of Canadians so that they are positioned to offer a judgment based on being informed instead of having no view at all. And the government obviously will take account of that. So Mr. Lametti, the Parliamentary Secretary, was just this last week in Atlantic Canada, in Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick, I believe, meeting with a whole bunch of organizations that have an interest to assess their point of view, to provide them with information, and he'll take that back as part of the consultative process.
And one of the things that's gotten a lot of press here is the so-called fast track authority that the president was given in this country, in which members of Congress have the opportunity to vote up or down, but not amend it in any way. What is the process like in Canada?
Well, in the Canadian parliamentary system with a majority government, fast track is equivalent in many respects to a final vote in Parliament, in which members will, like members of Congress, vote yes or no. If the government were to decide to support the bill, given that it has a majority, the odds overwhelmingly are that the bill would pass. Certainly, on the other side, and I actually was involved in NAFTA negotiations for a couple of chapters, investment and intellectual property, it's critical to your negotiating partners that you have the equivalent of fast track, because we're not about to be dinged 2, 3, 4, 5 times. We offer our best deal. You accept it or you don't. We negotiate that along the way. We don't expect to offer the maximum we're prepared to give in exchange for what we're going to get, only to find that members of the U.S. Congress then ask individually for more, for changes to the deal. So fast track is pretty critical. You're not going to, I would opine that you're not going to get any trade agreements without fast track authority, which is why you saw the particular TPP negotiations get into high gear and conclude only after fast track came last June.
And I'm sure you're well familiar with some of the debate and the positions that people who are perhaps less enthusiastic have made in this country. Similar things in Canada, people who are a bit more wary of these agreements?
There are people who are wary. Our existential cosmic crisis occurred in the late 1980s in Canada when we were negotiating free trade with the United States, something that had been discussed off and on during the entire course of our history, and no government had ever taken the plunge. They had always drawn back. The fear was that because your country is, in population terms and economic terms, 9 to 10 times the size of ours, that we would be dwarfed, we'd be overwhelmed. And when we finally bit the bullet and bought into free trade in the late 1980s with the United States, NAFTA then was a marginal add-on. Canadians didn't get nearly as worked up about NAFTA as Americans did, and we've since negotiated a number of discrete free trade agreements, as the U.S. has, and we've negotiated a very major one with the European Union, which should come into effect next year, 2017, and we think will position us very well. We'll be the only G7 country with guaranteed preferential market access within North America and to the European Union. And if TPP were to materialize, to the developed countries of the Pacific as well. That, I think, positions Canada extremely well as a platform from which to do business into the major economies of the world.
Well, now let's move on to something that sadly is on everybody's mind these days, just ISIS and the fight against terrorism. One of the changes that came with the last election was the decision taken to pull the CF-18 fighter jets from the mission in that theater. Talk a little bit about that process. I mean, how that plays out in the discussions.
Well, the new governing party, the Liberal Party of Canada, made clear as part of its platform and in the lead up to the election that it thought we could do things other than bombing, as in they didn't perceive that there's a Canadian comparative advantage when it came to bombing. Other countries could do that. What we could do, by contrast, and what we've invested more in, is training the Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurds, training opposition groups to ISIS. And so we will treble the number of trainers who we deploy. We'll continue to engage in air reconnaissance. We'll continue to engage in mid-air refueling. Our footprint in the region, the theater, will be significantly larger than it was. We simply are trading these new functions for bombing, as it were. And President Obama, the coalition, all seem to be fine with what it is we're doing, because they perceive, I believe, that maybe there is a Canadian comparative advantage in doing some of these other things that very much need to be done, and we're prepared to step up and do that.
Well, and Just on a more general level, I think people on this side of the border often don't have a sense of how active Canada's military is in other places around the world. Can you talk a little bit about where else we might find Canadian troops?
Well, we were a founding member of NATO. We're a founding member with you of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. On 9/11 in the mountain at Colorado Springs, the U.S. general was away, and the Canadian number 2 was in charge of grounding all air traffic across North America. We obviously have this vast airspace that during the Cold War, we were both concerned about protecting from Soviet incursions, whether aircraft or missiles. So we discharge that role. We were part of the coalition in the first Gulf War, for example. We were in 10 years in Afghanistan, where we were responsible for the theater in Kandahar on the Pakistani border. 160 Canadian military, a diplomat, a journalist, 160 folks died during the course of that 10-year campaign. We, the United States, the Brits and the French were jointly responsible for getting rid of Gaddafi in Libya, as in it was Canadian CF-18s that were engaged in that effort. So we have peacekeeping forces around the world. Historically, we've had more. The new government is committed very much to re-engaging that element of Canadian military deployment. So, we are a G7 economy. We are the United States' closest ally. We partner with America in so many places around the world, as well as with the Brits and the French and the Dutch and other key allies.
Well, that's great. I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the sort of domestic ramifications of the terror issue, and that's, again, something that's come up very prominently in the American campaign, and that's the notion of immigration and refugees. Talk a little bit about this initial target that was set of 25,000 refugees and where you stand with that.
Well, again, we actually had quite a public debate during our election campaign last autumn on this issue, and the party that proposed to bring the most refugees to Canada won the election. Canadian premiers, our equivalent of governors, are fully on side with this policy. And so Canada, which already is a major refugee accepting country, along with the United States, obviously, and frankly only a handful of other countries, announced that it would take 25,000 refugees, Syrian refugees, drawn from refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, all very carefully and thoroughly vetted, checked against United States databases, allied databases. We're taking the kinds of people who don't form the demographic that ISIS is interested in. In other words, single women with 2 young children, not the kind of people that are recruited to terrorist activities. And the Canadian model of resettling these people is very much to have private organizations, church groups, community associations step up, raise the funds necessary to provide a year or 2 of support for the refugee family, to be fully engaged in doing that, in helping them integrate. And there's government sponsorship, to be sure, but because it's a public outpouring on the part of individuals, it seems to work in Canada that we are capable of integrating people quite successfully. We're a multicultural country, so are you. Slightly higher percentage of our population wasn't born of our legal population, wasn't born in Canada compared to not being born in the United States. But obviously, we were talking to your colleague moments ago who is of Ukrainian extraction, and I said that there are 1 million Canadians who come from the Ukraine. who arrived in waves starting in the late 1800s, in fact, and it's a Canadian tradition.
Well, and yeah, let's talk a bit more about sort of the wider immigration policy, because it differs a bit from the U.S. But first, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're chatting with Canadian Consul General Roy Norton. Well, before the break, we were talking a little bit about refugees. Let's talk a little bit more about sort of the wider ongoing policy of immigration. It's a bit different, as you said. The portion of Canadians who are not necessarily native born may be a little higher in Canada than it is here. Now, the Liberal Party has proposed some changes. If you could talk a little bit about that, things like processing time for family reunification,
right,
and foreign worker programs, things like that, changes to the naturalization process in general. So what has been proposed?
Well, they've proposed some changes. They haven't proposed changes, significant ones, to the overall numbers. Canada takes 0.75% of our population every year in legal immigration. We're not an easy country to get to, and for the most part, Americans aren't streaming north across our border. So we can accept 275,000 folks and integrate them relatively easily. At the margins, the emphasis sometimes shifts as between business immigrants, students. We're very accommodating of students who come and study in Canada, staying beyond their graduation and working in Canada. Family reunification has always been a pillar, and the issue is what proportion of the accepted immigrants in any given year will be filled by family immigrants as compared to other categories. And the new government is disposed to increase the number of family immigrants. But fundamentally, the overall numbers won't change. We will still, in proportionate terms, accept way more refugees than like 3 times as many. The United States accepts 750,000, I don't mean refugees, immigrants, accepts 750,000 immigrants legally, give or take, each year. We accept 1/3 of that, but again, your population is 9 to 10 times larger than ours. So we think we're generous. This is not a charity program in the sense that we believe it to be in Canada's interests to accept well-identified, well-targeted immigrants who will integrate well, contribute to the economy. We have demographic challenges in our country, just as the United States does. We're both a lot better off than Japan or some other parts of the world. But we have to be mindful of renewing our country over the decades, and it's significantly through immigration that we do that.
So it seems, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but from the outside looking in, it seems as though some of the more shrill anti-immigration rhetoric that we've heard from the American campaign really isn't present in Canada. How would you account for that generally more accepting attitude?
Well, it's not. But a key point is that the Canadian-U.S. border is not perceived as being under threat. The border works well. Commerce transacts across the border. 400,000 folks go across it, but you don't perceive that Canadians are coming illegally into your country. We don't perceive that people are coming illegally across that border into our country. And so our debate in Canada is about numbers of people to accept from the rest of the world. you have this additional feature, as it were, of having to deal with illegal people who are regarded as illegal immigrants, and that seems to have been the focal point of the debate that you're referring to in your country. It's just not a phenomenon that exists in Canada.
Well, let's move on to one of the topics that the Prime Minister and the President discussed at some length: climate change. In 2014, Canada ranked last among OECD countries in Climate Change Performance Index. Now, that's something that I think the new government is committed to changing. Now, talk a little bit about sort of that transition. I mean, what was the perception sort of officially before and after the election?
Well, I'm not familiar with the particular index that you cite, but neither here nor there, the Government of Canada is very committed to addressing climate change. Governments in Canada have always accepted the science of man-made climate change. That's not been an issue. The issue may have been the extent to which they would emphasize it ahead of other policy priorities, the resources that they would expend. But the Government of Canada, I mean, Prime Minister Trudeau went to COP21 in Paris. Canada actually had the largest delegation of any country at COP21. More than half of our premiers were there. I mean, imagine if more than half of U.S. governors had accompanied President Obama. That's about the proportion of U.S. governors that are actually suing the EPA to try to stop climate change regulations from coming into effect in this country. So Canadians, as on the immigration issue, seem to be pretty much on side with the need to do something about this. Canada has the world's largest coastline, longest coastline, so we naturally deal with the effects of rising sea levels, and as a result, there seems to be a pronounced commitment to address it. We've offered, in terms of one of the aspects of COP21 is a fund to assist developing countries in making changes. We've committed something like $2.5 billion over 5 years. The U.S. has committed $4 billion. Again, proportionately, our contribution is very significant. We signed the deal. We'll be there in April for the formal signing process. The Prime Minister and the President discussed that in Washington during the state visit that you referenced at the top just a couple weeks ago now, 3 weeks ago now. And we are committed to implementing what we've said we'll do. And we're encouraged that China and other major emitting developing countries have signed on to this deal as they had not done to Kyoto or to Copenhagen in December of 2009. So there's scope, we think, to make this one work, which will make it easier for everybody to follow through with their contributions.
Well, and in the most recent visit by the Prime Minister was the Nuclear Security Summit, at which time Canada's former U.S. Ambassador Paul Meyer and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament said non-proliferation is an area where Canada is a traditional leader. What do you think he meant?
Well, I think Canada disavowed nuclear weapons decades ago. And so Paul, whom I know, I served with him at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, a brilliant man and very passionately committed. He was our ambassador to the UN for disarmament, very committed to bringing countries together, as sometimes third parties can do, particularly during the Cold War, to recognize that they needed, or at least that it was optimum to reduce their arsenals, and secondly, that they should take every measure possible to guard against proliferation. We don't believe in, a nuclear weapon in every backyard, and we'll continue to work very hard to ensure that that doesn't happen. We don't think that the answer to the world's problems is for more countries to have nuclear weapons.
Well, I'd like to ask you to just take a step back and comment on something. One of the inaugural statements by Prime Minister Trudeau was a historical reference to sunny ways. And talk a little bit about, in your view, sort of what the Canadian image of sunny ways that he was referencing might be.
Well, what he is talking about is a positive, constructive, solutions-oriented approach to governance. He doesn't see any particular point in accentuating negativity, in emphasizing what's impossible. Let's bring people together. Let's not try arbitrarily, opportunistically to divide them. And this resonated very much during the Canadian election campaign. It was his approach then, and Canadians took note, it seemed, and opted for that approach, and he has been extremely consistent. He and his government have been extremely consistent ever since in terms of domestic policy, but also in their relations with the rest of the world, the United States and other countries, looking for common ground, trying to find compromise, helping people understand how they can get to yes, how they can advance the ball down the field in the direction of the goal, and look for win-win situations.
Well, very good. Consul General Norton, thank you for joining us.
It's been a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you, and your listeners, your viewers.
Your viewers, we'll see you next time.
Okay.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.